I'm curious if you've ever noticed this. In life, sometimes it feels like we have formulas or rituals that we follow, that we think if we follow them, that things will go well. It's kind of like check boxes that we check off in life. And that can be something with finances, with relationships, with family, that when things are going well, we think we're following the formula well. And if we're not following the formula well, then life must be going bad. If life is going bad, then we're not following the formula correctly. I think even for those of us that would say that we're Christ followers or Christians might even apply this to faith, that we treat faith kind of like a formula. And as we close our sermon series in Jonah today, we're going to be talking with Pastor Trevor about how faith maybe isn't exactly a formula. So I think you're going to really enjoy the message for today. Just as well, if you're the type of person that is looking forward to summer because there are summer blockbuster movies that are going on, that are coming out in theaters and having big opening weekends, and you maybe want to live some of the nostalgia of some of the 90s, some of the good movies, the time when cinema was at its greatest, when you had a blockbuster card in your pocket and could go and rent VHS tapes from the movie store, I have a feeling you're going to really like our next sermon series. So make sure to stick around for the end of the service and I'll give you a sneak peek of what that's going to be like. Thank you for being here today, and welcome to SMCC Online. Thank you, Ryan and the band, for that song and leading us in that today. Before we jump into the message with Pastor Trevor and the rest of our locations, what I want to do is just let you know about some really just cool things that are happening across our locations and really across our church. One of the things I found that was so interesting is just from July 1st, back in 2021, that's when actually our year runs in the SMCC. It starts July 1st, so we keep track of things that way. One of the things that I think has been really cool to see, since we're all about next steps and helping people become fully devoted and fully delighted followers of Jesus Christ, is across our location since July 1st, we have seen 64 people baptized at SMCC, which I think is just awesome. And maybe even just as cool, what we've seen across our locations is there's been over 1,500 people involved in a class or a group since July 1st. I think that that's just a crazy big number of people taking their next step, wanting to learn more, wanting to grow in community, and just wanting to take their next step in becoming fully devoted and fully delighted in Jesus Christ. And really all of this happens because there are hundreds of people out there who give faithfully and regularly to SMCC. And so maybe you've heard about this before, about what it looks like to give to SMCC, and you're just trying to figure out what that is or what it even looks like, or maybe you come from a background before where people forced you to give. And here's the thing, we think it's an honor and a delight to give to SMCC if you call SMCC home. And so I just want to let you know that you can get more information on what that looks like at smccutah.org/give. And right now, actually, you can even donate to SMCC via cryptocurrency. There's actually over 40 different cryptocurrencies that we now accept. And that same information is on that page, smccutah.org/give. And so there's lots of options for it. I would encourage you, even if you're just thinking about it, to look into it more, and you can find more information there. We're going to go ahead now and wrap up our series for Jonah. This is week 3 of it with Pastor Trevor and the rest of our locations talking about Jonah and wrapping up the second half of the book. So let's go ahead and join him now.
Hey, thanks for joining us this morning. So glad to be with you. Looking forward to wrapping up our Jonah series today. I want to give a special shout out to those joining down in Lehigh. So good to be with you in this way. It was great being with you a couple weeks ago. Looking forward to being back with you in just a couple of weeks. So, all right, let's get started. There's a saying among athletes that goes like this: when you're good, you don't need to be lucky. It sounds like such a well-grounded, such a sensible, such a confident saying, and yet, when it comes to the greatest athletes of all time, they have not agreed with the sentiment. For example, Michael Jordan, arguably the greatest basketball player of all time. Under every professional game he played, with every professional game, he wore underneath his shorts, his college basketball shorts from the University of North Carolina. Tiger Woods, arguably the greatest golfer ever. Every professional tournament that he played in, when Sunday rolled around, he wore the same exact colors, right? Red. And perhaps my most favorite among them, Serena Williams, the tennis star. When she is on a roll, she will continue to wear the same pair of socks over and over and over again without even washing them between matches. And they do these things because they believe that they somehow contribute to their performance, that these rituals, these practices, you could say these formulas, help them win. As a church, we talk a lot about joy and a lot about delight. The idea being that we believe that we find our joy and our delight in this life in God. And I think one of the things that's interesting about that is it can be very easy to take that idea and kind of misconstrue it and construct this formula to interpret it that I think in a lot of ways goes quite wrong. But the formula goes like this, right? That, my joy, my delight is found in God. So the way that must operate is if I devote myself to God, then God will deliver to me all of the things that I'm looking for, right? I do for God and God does for me in what I'm desiring. So I understand that that's where my joy is. That's kind of how we look look at the formula. And yet, that is not what we're saying, right? That is a recipe for disaster, and it's not what the Bible teaches, right? That formula isn't how things actually operate. And the more that we find ourselves leaning into that, right, whether intentional or not, I think what we often experience is finding ourselves down the road looking at God with this anger, being upset, with this frustration that I'm putting in all of this work, I'm performing in all of these ways, I'm putting my work into the formula, and yet you're not holding up your end of the deal. You're not delivering. I'm doing for you, but you're not doing for me. And it leaves us in a place where we're frustrated and angry and venting against God. And it's because faith isn't a formula, right? Though we often think it is. Right? Faith isn't a formula. Today we're wrapping up our series through the book of Jonah, and as we've seen over the past couple of weeks, the book of Jonah is remarkably complex, even in its brevity, touching on so many themes, from the gospel and race to nationalism, politics, evangelism, grace and power, and so many more. It's a story about a prophet who was so undevoted and undelighted in his faith that his story serves as more of a warning of what not to be, rather than a model to be followed or someone whose words we should listen to. And yet there's been one big reason why we've been doing this series, why we've taken 3 weeks to walk through this. And it's because there's some Jonah and there's some Nineveh in each of us, Nineveh being the city that Jonah was sent to preach against. And the way the book operates is just fascinating, drawing in our attention, capturing our attention, fascinating us, lowering our defenses so that it can pull out some truth buried deep inside as it provides an x-ray of what's broken in us in order to display with the utmost clarity what's broken inside. It's a book about so many things, but I think more than anything else, what it reveals to us is the brokenness in us as a spiritual x-ray. And what we'll see today as we bring this series to a close is how God is actually working with Jonah to bring correction, to bring healing, to bring a fix to the brokenness in him. Right up until this point, we have seen the brokenness displayed with incredible clarity. And now what we'll see today is God working to reset the brokenness in Jonah, which matters for us because unknowingly or even intentionally so, we may find ourselves today to be living with that very same formula. And so let's jump into it now. Picking up the story, we are looking at the latter half of the book today, chapters 3 and 4. And in these chapters, where we're picking it up, it's right on the heels of a pretty wild experience for Jonah, where at the very beginning of the book, God tells him to go to Nineveh, deliver his message to them, right? Jonah runs in the opposite direction, sailing as far away as he can. A storm swirls up, he winds up overboard, and then right as he's about to drown, this great fish swallows him and then spits him up a few days later along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And so where we're at, Jonah has just been spit up, right? He just has gotten his release from this disgusting, vile, bile-filled belly of this great fish. And it's at this point that he receives this command from God. Chapter 3, verse 1. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. This time around, when he receives the exact same command, after everything that he's been through, at this point, the command hasn't changed, but Jonah has, because now he realizes how hopeless it is to run away from God. And so he listens, he obeys, he goes to Nineveh. And this is what happens there. Verse 3. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. The Ninevites believed God. That was their response. They hear his message and they believe. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth, that being kind of a visible demonstration of their sorrow, of their mourning, right? The wearing of sackcloth, kind of similar to how we would wear black to a funeral. Right? It's a way of wearing clothing that demonstrates our sorrow and our mourning. One of the things that's interesting about this passage is if you dig into some of the original language around Jonah's message, the very last word in what he says, overthrown, can actually be taken in a couple of different ways. Right? On the one hand, it can mean destruction. So the message would be 40 more days and Nineveh will be destroyed. And I think it's pretty clear that that's what Jonah intended. That's what he's trying to communicate. And yet, the word does have a secondary meaning, and it means transformed. And so the message could very well be 40 more days and Nineveh will be destroyed if you choose to not listen, to not repent, to not respond appropriately to this, or 40 more days and Nineveh will be transformed because of the response to the message. And again, between the two of them, I think it's pretty clear what Jonah intended, and yet it's interesting to see that the potential for that latter meaning of transformation is baked into it right there. So Jonah delivers this message, and the entire city, from the greatest to the least, they all believe and they respond, right? It even says later in chapter 3 that when word finally reaches the king, he declares a citywide fast in the hopes that God might see their sorrow, see their mourning, and relent from his anger and his destruction against them. All right, and this, I think what we see here is just an incredible response for a communicator, right? For a pastor or a preacher or a public speaker, really of any kind. This is like pitching a perfect game. You do not see a response like this where Jonah walks in. He declares such a short message in the entire city, right? Not a few people, not a portion of the city, but the entire city listens and responds and believes. You don't see a response like that. And I think what adds even further to the audacity of it is when you take a second look at what Jonah actually said. And even more so, what he didn't say. All right, looking back at this, verse 4, he says 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. That is the sum total of the message that he delivers. And even more so, it tells us that Nineveh would have taken 3 days for him to go through the entirety of it and deliver his message to everyone. He goes in 1 day, delivers the message, and then walks right out. It's like he's trying to do the absolute minimum, right? And his message is only 8 words in English. It's actually 5 in the Hebrew language. And look at what he doesn't say. Right? There's no mention of why they're being judged, how they're supposed to respond. He doesn't even mention God at all. It's like he's trying to say the absolute minimum in the hopes that they will not listen, that they won't respond, that they won't believe. And yet they do. This is like a comedian getting up on stage and trying to flop, trying to fail, telling their absolute worst jokes, and yet at every line they deliver, the audience erupts in applause and laughter. Right? There's an irony to the response here. And yet I think for Jonah, there's still one sliver of hope that he's holding on to, one last thread that he has to give him hope for the outcome that he desires. And it's that despite Nineveh's response, right, despite all of their sorrow and their mourning and their sackcloth and ashes and everything that they're doing, despite all of that, none of that actually changes what they deserve. None of that impacts at all what they have earned, because it doesn't change the things that they have done. And so I think Jonah is holding on to that in the hope that God will still deliver to them the judgment that they have earned. And yet, this is how God responds. Chapter 3, verse 10. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. He relented and did not bring on them the destruction that he had threatened. Jonah's worst fears are realized, and in response, he blows up, right? He explodes. He lashes out at God, blowing up on him. And in a moment, we'll take a second and jump a little bit further into the particulars of what he says. But first, I just want to make an observation about this. And I think what Jonah shows us through the story up until this point, but especially right here, right, in the way that he responds to God extending grace, in the way that he responds to God doing something that he doesn't desire, what that shows us is that wanting what God wants is crucial to delight. Wanting what God wants is crucial to delight, right? Sometimes we find ourselves living according to that very same formula. I do for God and God does for me according to my desire. And yet when that doesn't work, we often find ourselves in the very same place as Jonah, right? Angry, upset, in disbelief, blowing up on God because he's not keeping his end of the bargain. And I think what's fascinating about that is when we find ourselves in that place, it's not all that often that we raise the question, consider the question ourselves, what is it that God desires? Because that's not part of the formula, right? He exists to serve our desires, not us his, because that's not the formula. But all right, let's jump into it and see what Jonah actually says. Chapter 4, starting at verse 1. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, right? This seemed flat out ridiculous. This seemed egregious. This seemed like something that should never happen. This extension of grace to such horrible people. And he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? This is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity, a God who just can't judge when judgment is what's needed. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." Jonah is so outraged, right? In so much disbelief. He just blows up on God here. And what he does is he actually takes the very character of God himself, right? The pieces of God's nature that we so often celebrate and soak in, God's loving and gracious and compassionate nature, the parts of God that we delight in, and he throws them in God's face as an insult. It's not exactly what you expect from a prophet, but then again, Jonah is anything but your typical prophet. But I think there's something to kind of consider here as well, and it's that sometimes when we see such an unabashed desire for judgment like this, it can seem so far removed from our modern sensibilities. This can feel so strange, so foreign for us. How could anybody talk like that? How could anybody feel like Jonah feels here? Because we see this and we think to ourselves, I would never wish that upon anyone. So we often think. Pastor and author Tim Keller, in writing his own commentary upon the book of Jonah, he says this about it, that many people in the modern West are not troubled by God's mercy. That's not an issue. God's mercy is love, is grace. That's not troubling for us because they don't accept the idea of a God who judges. They want a God of love. But a God who does not get angry when evil destroys the creation he loves is ultimately not a loving God at all. All right, just to backtrack here, they want a God of love, meaning a God of love to the absence of judgment. Now, judgment not being one of the behaviors that belongs to this God. That's the way that we understand love. But his argument is that a God who does not get angry when evil destroys the creation he loves, right? To put it into the terms of the story, when the Ninevites go about destroying nations, breaking up families, mocking and shaming and ridiculing individuals before they take their lives with incredible cruelty, right? Doing all of these things to people who are created in God's image that God loves, would you really call him a loving God if he didn't respond in anger to those kinds of actions? Because I think what's at the heart of the matter is that it's real and direct encounters with evil in this world that instill within us a gratitude that God is not only loving, but also just. It's real and direct encounters with evil that lead us to be thankful for God's justice. And if I could just press into it just a little bit further here. Right, even in light of the recent events in our country's history, just the past few weeks with the tragedy that took place in Texas, right? So many children, lives lost, the lives of so many people in general lost. And if you were to insert yourself into that situation and just imagine that one of those children were your own, or even if they were your younger brother or your younger sister, right? A 7, 8-year-old that you send off to school and then they never come home. I have to imagine that in a situation like that, that some desire for justice, some desire for judgment would arise within you, that in some small way, God's righteous anger, his wrath, might provide a comfort. Because it's real and direct encounters with evil like that in this world that instill within us a gratitude not only for God's love, but also his justice. And that's exactly the perspective that Jonah is coming from. For him, the question isn't how can God judge? The question is how can God forgive people who are as evil as this? And if I could add, it's not a question that Jonah wrestles with particularly well. But after he blows up on God in that manner, this is how God responds to Jonah. Verse 4, but the Lord replied, is it right for you to be angry? Is it right for you to be angry at my extension of grace to these people? Jonah just ignores the question altogether. He doesn't even respond. He just leaves the city, goes and finds himself a place outside of it to sit and to stew and to just be miserable. And it's in the midst of that God provides an object lesson for him. And this is what happens. Looking at verse 6. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant while Jonah's outside of the city and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. First time in the story, we see Jonah with a smile on his face. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, it would be better for me to die than to live. We see Jonah's emotions just continue to spike and spiral all over the place, that he gets this plant, it provides him some nice shade, and he is deliriously happy. And then the plant is taken away, and the wind picks up, and the sun is blazing, and just like that, all over again, he is miserable and asking God to take his life. Again, for the second time in the book. And once more, God responds to him in this way. Verse 9. But God said to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? It is, he said, and I'm so angry I wish I were dead. It sounds like a conversation. At this point, it starts to read like a conversation between a parent and a 3-year-old who is overdue for their nap, just kind of throwing a fit, emotions all over the place. But I think what we see through this passage, especially through chapter 4 here and everything that's happening with the plant and the worm and the sun and the wind and the questions and the conversation that are happening between Jonah and God here, is that up until this point, the book has provided us the spiritual x-ray to show us the brokenness inside of Jonah. We've seen his heart. And within these events, this is God working to bring about healing. This is God working to reset the bone, to fix and bring correction and healing to the brokenness inside of Jonah. And to that end, at the very close of the book, God says these last words and poses this one final question to Jonah. Verse 10. But the Lord said, you have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals? Right, the essence of God's statement being, right, just drawing out the comparison in Jonah's emotional response. He's saying that this plant that you have done literally nothing for, right? And I mean, it's a plant, right? It's a plant. It's not a human being, it's a plant. This has been destroyed and you are angry to the point that you're willing to die. You're asking me to take your life. That's the emotional response you're having. And at the same time, when I choose to show compassion and to extend grace to a city filled with 120,000 people, people created in my image, people whom I love, regardless of what they have done, you find yourself in that same anger. right? Miserable to the point of asking me to take your life. Your compassion is for plants. That's what your emotional response shows. And mine is for people. Maybe you need to look at your priorities, is what God is saying here to Jonah as he works to reset the bone. And I think what's fascinating about the book of Jonah is that we never actually get his response. The book closes here on God's question, him posing this to Jonah. And we never get to see how he responds because it's written in such a way, not so much as to deliver to us the kind of satisfying conclusion that we often long for and enjoy within a story, but it's written to cause us to consider ourselves the very same question concerning our priorities and the way that we relate to God, and even perhaps the formula with which we are approaching him. Because as we've seen across these last several weeks, there is some Jonah and some Nineveh in each of us. And when it comes to Jonah in particular, the more that we recognize that, the more we're able to avoid following in the very same steps as him. Because when we can recognize it, we're able to reorient ourselves, to redraft our understanding of grace, to be able to understand that we receive grace as a gift. We don't earn it through a formula. We receive grace as a gift. We don't earn it through a formula. Jonah, through his actions, through his words, through everything he's done throughout the entirety of this story, has shown us that he is working with a complete and utter lack of understanding when it comes to grace. Because in his mind, grace is something that you earn. It's something that you either deserve or do not deserve. It's black and white, and there is no extending it to those who are not good enough. The formula operates in a particular way, and that's how Jonah understands things. And so in his mind, what's transpired in this story is it's like he has done all of this work through the entirety of his life. I mean, he's a Hebrew. He belongs to the people of God, right? He is a prophet. He wears that title. He wears that mantle. And so he's done all of this to come in first place within this competition. And then God goes and turns and hands out participation medals to the entire city of Nineveh that all read number 1, saying the exact same thing as Jonah's. And in Jonah's mind, he's not cool with that. Right? He's not all right with finishing in the same exact place as these other people who have done horrific things and even harmed people that he has loved. And if you ever find yourself in a place where you are withholding grace from others because you look at them as not being good enough, right, as not living up to the same standard that you have, and upset with God when things go better for them than they do for you, then perhaps there's some Jonah in you as well. And you might be working according to the very same formula. Right, but as we've looked at across the past several weeks, there's some Nineveh in us as well. And I think the text doesn't go into as much work to diagnose exactly what's happening within the heart of Nineveh as it does with Jonah. But I think there's still some things that we can take away from it. And if I was to provide an explanation as to what it means for there to be some Nineveh in us, I think what we see is that they respond to God very differently. That they have an understanding that they have fallen short, that they have not lived up to God's expectations, that they are not good enough. And maybe you're here and you identify with that a whole lot more than you do with Jonah. Right? Maybe you've had a season in your life, maybe you're even in a season of your life right now where you understand viscerally, right, that there is something wrong inside. Right, that you have fallen short, that there are regrets that mark your life, that there are stains upon your track record, that you are not perfect, that you have not earned what you needed to earn. Right, I know I've had seasons of my life like that. I've had one particular season that was especially how I would describe it, where it was like my understanding of how life was supposed to work was like it's almost like you work with it like you hop on a bicycle and you start riding, and then all of a sudden the bicycle falls to pieces, and in the wreckage and in the aftermath, you're left reeling, trying to figure out what happened, what is life about? What direction am I supposed to go? What is this supposed to be? Because whatever I was living according to before, that's not it. And you're left in this place where it feels like I don't know what's right, but I know I'm not. And if that resonates with you, there might be some Nineveh in you as well. But I think even though their response to God is different than Jonah's, and you could even say more noble than Jonah's, and that they acknowledge their faults, they acknowledge their shortcomings, I think there's still something underneath the surface that is lacking. And I think you could say that even though they recognize their shortcomings, it still seems that they are living according to the very same formula. Right? It's just the other side of the coin, but it's the same exact formula as Jonah because they both believe they have to earn it. Right? It's just that Jonah, he believes he has. And because he believes he has, he's not willing to extend it to anyone else who hasn't. So he has no grace to offer. He has no grace to give. Either you meet the standard or you don't. Whereas the Ninevites, they're agreed on the same standard. They're living according to the same formula, but because they haven't met it, they've got no grace to offer either. And so whichever side you fall on, right, it's the same, it's the two different sides of the same coin of living according to this formula of trying to earn grace. And either way, it leaves you in a place where you have no grace to offer, right? Either to those who have fallen short of the standard or those who have self-righteously believe that they have. But the bottom line is, when grace is received as a gift, the recipients turn into givers. When grace is received as a gift, the recipients turn into givers, right? The Jonah in us realizes that we haven't met the standard, and so we can offer grace to others as well, even people that are different from us, people that maybe before we would have said hadn't lived up to the same standard, right? And on the other side of the coin, once we are able to receive it as a gift, we're able to extend it even to those who perhaps fall more into the Jonah camp, the self-righteous side, because we understand that it's a grace for all of us. Because when we receive grace as a gift, rather than trying to earn it, the recipients turn into givers. It enables us, it frees us up to give grace. The interesting thing about a gift is, though, that it always comes at a cost. A gift always has a price to be paid by someone, not the recipient, but by the giver. And when it comes to this gift of grace that is given to us so freely, the truth is a price was paid in order to deliver it. Right? It's the price that Jesus Christ paid when he gave his life upon the cross in our place for our gift so that we could receive grace, so that we could become the recipients of this wonderful and marvelous gift and live in it and walk in it and enjoy it for all the days of our lives and even into eternity. And so the price has been paid. The question is, are you willing to receive the gift? And are you willing to give it to others? Right, at the end of this series, I think that's the question that we need to sit with. And so, would you pray with me? Jesus, we thank you that you paid the price for us to be able to receive this gift freely, right? A gift that we could never earn, that we could never be good enough to deserve. And yet, because of you, because of your perfect life, because of your perfection, because of your sacrifice in our place, we can now receive it freely and walk in it daily, today and for the rest of our lives. And so we thank you for your grace. We thank you for your sacrifice. We thank you for the gift that you've given to us. And we ask that you would enable us to also give it to others. In your name, amen.
Thank you so much, Pastor Trevor, for wrapping up this series with us. I know that I've really enjoyed it. I think people across our locations have really enjoyed it as well and gotten something great out of it. What I'd love to have you do is if you have more questions about what is your next step here at SMCC or your next step in your walk with Jesus, we've got a whole part of our website that's dedicated to that. And so what you can do is you can visit smccutah.org/nextsteps. And maybe the next step for you is simply connecting with one of our staff members or pastors. And on the Next Steps page, there's actually a connect button that's at the top of the page. You can click that, it takes 30 seconds to fill out, and whoever is best suited to connect with you will reach out to you and just figure out what the next step is. Maybe it's just connecting with them and saying, hey, I just gotta know what to do next, or I just need to come visit the location. Whatever it might be, we have those next steps for you on that page. Now, what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of a sneak peek of what we have coming up. Like I said, it's summer. It is the time for blockbuster movies. And so we've got a little bit of a series based off of that. So let's go ahead and take a sneak peek at our upcoming series right now. I hope to see you here next week or one of our locations. Take care.